So the structure for today's presentation. So I'm going to first share a little about the Dutch-Australian Shared Histories Partnership. We'll then get a glimpse into the lives and stories of some of the Dutch migrants who embarked on a journey to make Australia home. I'll then show you how you can use our collection database record search to begin your own research. We may also hear then from Marika from the Huygens Institute. I'm not sure if she's joined yet, but if she joins, we'll make sure we do that. And as mentioned, we'll also do some questions at the end. All right. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land from which I come to you today. So I'm in Canberra, in Australia, the Ngunnawal people. And pay my respects to the people, their cultures, and the elders, past and present. Australia and the Netherlands are connected through our shared cultural history spanning over 400 years. The 2021 census recorded over 66,000 Australian residents having been born in the Netherlands, with over 380,000 Australians self-nominating as having Dutch ancestry. The Dutch-Australian Shared Histories four-stage partnership between the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Netherlands National Archief, the Huygens Institute for Netherlands History, and the National Archives of Australia began in 2018. The goal of the partnership is to explore and identify a range of records that illustrate the connections and shared history between Australia and the Netherlands, and digitise a portion of these identified records to make them accessible online from anywhere in the world. Now, it's difficult to summarise the amazing work done throughout this project in just a few words. So for the purpose of this webinar, I'm mostly going to focus on the research and digitisation of stage 4, which is the final stage of the partnership. From a research perspective, the journey of the Dutch-Australian Shared Histories project began with the undertaking of a large-scale scoping study to identify relevant records. As a result of these dedicated and thorough efforts, over 11,000 records in various formats were identified relating to our country's shared migration, mercantile, maritime and military history. In fact, one of my colleagues, he spent so much time conducting this research, so many weeks, that I would not have been surprised if he began speaking Dutch in his sleep. In addition to those records, and of special significance to those of Dutch ancestry, we also identified that we hold tens of thousands of records relating to individual Dutch migrants. So that's on top of the 11,000. Across the four stages of this partnership, over 1,280 culturally significant records were digitised. And now the first 700-odd records digitised as part of the earlier stages of the project covered a range of records across various topics, including diplomatic treaties, agreements, immigration policy files, military, passenger manifests, index cards, but essentially a wide range of topics illustrating the relationship between Australia and the Netherlands. And those were the focus of our previous Shared Histories webinar in 2022. For stage 4 of the project, however, 500 records were selected solely from a series of migrant selection documents. Migrant selection documents, for those who may not have heard of them before, they are the applications to migrate to Australia. So they're completed by the applicant and returned to the Chief Migration Officer in the capital city of the country in which the applicant was living. Migrant selection documents are great files as a general rule. They usually contain quite a bit of detail, including migrant's name, nationality, date and place of birth, spouse, children, education and employment history, medical reports, as well as travel and accommodation arrangements. Many also include small photographs, such as those you can see pictured around on this slide. So they really are a goldmine in terms of family history research and a wonderful resource. These records document a significant moment in the lives of migrants as they packed up and prepared to leave for their new life in Australia. The last 500 records, we're getting some people who can't see the slides. Is that an isolated incident? Can some people see the slides, or are we getting, sorry guys? Yep, okay, we're getting a lot of thumbs up. Okay, might be an isolated incident, so Caroline, I'll let you tackle that one. The last 500 records selected for digitisation under the project were selected across a range of surnames, family sizes, and year of application. They were chosen not for prominence or for fame, but rather to make available a range of individual migration records of ordinary, everyday Dutch Australians. Because ultimately, this is what archives hold the stories of everyday people, capturing a moment in time, and for the subjects and families of those records, preservation of a memory. The stories in today's webinar will highlight just a few of these newly digitised immigration records. And in addition to today's webinar, web and video stories of people's migration experiences from the Netherlands to Australia will also be able to be viewed on our website in the coming days. Now, a little bit of background first. Dutch migration to Australia had been relatively small scale prior to Federation in 1901. When the first national census was conducted in Australia in 1911, only 650 people recorded having been born in the Netherlands, and only small numbers born in the Dutch East Indies, as it was known at the time. In general, migration was small scale and based around individuals or family groups rather than large scale programs. At the time of a couple of decades later, at the time of the 1933 census, there were just under 1,300 Dutch-born residents. At that time, there were obstacles to migrating to Australia, even for those Dutch who might have wished to come at that time. The Netherlands at that time had a low rate of immigration, and Australia was not generally encouraging of non-British Europeans. In the 1920s, Australia imposed restrictions on European migrants. These included visa requirements and the requirement to have landing money with them. The Central Immigration Foundation Holland, an organisation that consulted with potential immigrants, noted in a letter to Australia House that the requirement to have £40 of landing money with them when they arrived was a serious obstacle to immigration to Australia, with the fare from Europe to Australia already costing £40. The letter then went on to express, and you can see that letter in the middle there, that Dutch migrants would be good settlers and agricultural workers who could help to develop Australia. Some thought was given to encouraging the migration of Dutch farmers whose skills might be transferable to an Australian setting. The Australian authorities eventually came around to this view as well. In 1936, when the new Consul General of the Netherlands visited the Minister of External Affairs, the topic of Dutch migration was on the agenda, and the Minister inquired of the Consul General what the possibility would be of sourcing Dutch agricultural workers to migrate to Australia. In 1939, an agreement was made between Australia and the Netherlands Immigration Foundation that agricultural workers, single women, and skilled artisans could have their landing money requirements lowered, and that the foundation would provide support for them after their migration. However, this agreement never had time to come into effect because of the outbreak of the Second World War. After World War II, conditions in the Netherlands saw large numbers of immigrants seeking new lives overseas. Many Dutch people lost their lives during German occupation and Allied bombing, and as Europe was facing economic and social devastation alongside concerns of overcrowding and unemployment, the Dutch government soon adopted a policy of support for active emigration. At the same time, Australia was suffering from shortages in its workforce, and its small population and isolation increased its sense of vulnerability. Arthur Calwell, the first Minister for Immigration, declared in 1945 that more migration was urgent and imperative for Australia to survive, and he called for migration from not only the UK, but also from European continental countries. Australia began seeking migration agreements with other nations, and one of the first signed was with the Netherlands. The Netherlands-Australia Migration Agreement of 1951 facilitated the immigration of Dutch people to Australia, including those residing in the Netherlands East Indies following Indonesia's independence. The agreement provided for assisted passage for young Dutch migrants, agricultural workers, and skilled artisans. They were to be received and housed in migrant reception centres in Australia. So here you can see a page from a Tomorrow's Australians booklet advertising migration to Australia, where those migrating from the Netherlands were praised for their ability to bring native skill to our farmlands. So that was a sort of an advertisement to Yeah, encourage people. When the agreement was renegotiated in 1956, eligibility for assisted passage was expanded. Adult migrants were required to remain in Australia in employment approved by the Australian government for 2 years, but were also given assurances that Australia would render every assistance to help them find work through the Commonwealth Employment Service. So here you can see a chart which shows some of the types of immigration records we hold relating to Dutch Australian migrants, including passenger lists of ships and planes, alien registration documents, migrant accommodation centre records, naturalisation records, and migrant selection documents. Despite the change and a strong drive for migration, those wanting... Oh, we're still having some issues with the slides by the sound of it. Okay. Hopefully that's not affecting too many people. We will be, I believe we will be recording this as well, so you will be able to hopefully see that one afterwards. Caroline is troubleshooting, so they have changed. We have changed a few. Okay, yes, so we're getting some people who can see it. Oh, okay. All right. I might just continue, but anyone who is having trouble seeing the slides moving on, as I said, we will have a version of this that you can watch afterwards. And hopefully you'll be able to see all of the slides in that one. Oh, we're getting quite a few. Okay. Oh dear. Okay, let me have a look. Seems to be about 50-50. Okay, so it looks like one person, they closed, so they left and then rejoined. So that might be an option if you're having some issues. Okay. So despite a strong drive for migration, those wanting to migrate to Australia still had to go through an extensive application process. Would-be migrants were required to undergo detailed medical examinations and x-rays to ensure they were in good health, would not burden the healthcare system, or carry in illnesses such as tuberculosis. Criminal checks were also undertaken, along with interviews by the selection officer to determine skill, employability, standard of education, character, motivations for migration, and overall likelihood of assimilation into the Australian community, as well as acceptance of conditions including attending English classes. Anybody is having trouble and they do have the option to navigate forward, we are on slide 7 now. Once everything was approved, migrants were generally given a planned date of departure to allow them time to begin preparing for their journey to Australia. Many ships were chartered specifically to carry migrants from the Netherlands, several of which are listed here. So this was strategic, so I wouldn't need to pronounce all of those ship names because my pronunciation, as you'll find out through the rest of the presentation, is not fantastic. So you also see in a few stories, travel didn't stop when migrants reached Australia. Some migrants had to travel hundreds of kilometres by train or car to reach their new homes. One letter, pictured here in the right-hand corner, details the plea of a Dutch Australian man who had sponsored his brother to come to Australia. And his brother was set to arrive by ship in Melbourne. But as he was living in Queensland at the time, he wrote to ask if there was any chance his brother's ship would also be going past Brisbane, as it would make for an easier collection for him. Now, I know we have quite a few international viewers today, so for context, for anyone from the Netherlands, the distance from Melbourne to Brisbane in Australia is over 1,700 kilometres, or the equivalent of driving from Amsterdam to Rome. The key period of Dutch immigration was between 1949 and 1970, with 160,000 Dutch people migrating to Australia during that period. During that time, the Netherlands was one of the top 10 countries of people migrating to Australia. So what I'm going to do now is delve into a few of those stories of migrants whose migrant selection documents were recently digitised as part of Stage 4 of the Shared Histories Partnership. And this is where you're going to find my pronunciation a bit fun, so forgive me. So the first story we'll be looking at today is that of Joseph and Josie Teunissen. Joseph and his fiancée, Josie, were each born in the Netherlands in the 1930s, and in 1956 they applied for assisted passage under the Australian and Netherlands Migration Agreement. They passed their medical examinations and interviews with flying colours, with a summarization from the selection officer stating that the couple was pleasing and should be well received, quite okay on appearance and intelligence. While Joseph was a clerical worker in the Netherlands, the selection officer explained to him that his English was not yet sound enough to be a clerical worker in Australia, and Joseph stated he was prepared to accept alternate work. On the 26th of September 1956, they boarded their ship at Amsterdam, ready to begin their journey to Australia. Here we can see the pages from the digitised, one of the pages from the digitised migrant selection document, the notes from a selection officer, and a photograph of the ship. Now, while we don't have any specific details about how their journey went, we do know from the ship report upon arrival that there were no illnesses or issues raised by any of the passengers during the voyage, so hopefully the trip was smooth for Joseph and Yossi. Pictured at the very top, we can see the Teunissen's name on the passenger list. So, bright and early at 7 a.m. on the 5th of November 1956, the ship arrived into Australia. So that's a 40-day journey. Which, if you can imagine being on a ship for 40 days, or perhaps people listening in say some of them have been. We can imagine that Joseph and Yossi were likely keen to disembark from the ship, but first they needed to wait for customs officials to do their checks and interviews. Around lunchtime, with all the checks finally done, Joseph and Yossi finally stepped foot on land and into the country that would be their new home. Like many migrants who came under the assisted passage scheme, the couple required interim accommodation while they settled in. Majority of the ship's passengers were transported to the train station later that afternoon to take the trains to migrant accommodation. For Joseph and Yossi, their destination was the Sheville Migrant Hostel, around 40 kilometres, so about half an hour outside of Sydney. The facilities of the hostel were modest and sometimes a little cramped. Migrants were housed in barracks-style accommodation, and two large buildings were utilised as kitchens, communal dining hall, a school, and a recreation hall. But while humble in appearance, many migrants have expressed fond memories of their time there, a place where some made lifelong friends and connections and gave them a sense of community in an unfamiliar environment. Here we can see some photographs of the Sheville Migrant Hostel around the same time, same year that the Teunissens were there, giving us a glimpse into some of their first sights and experiences in Australia. So you can see some on the right. The right four photographs are from the Migrant Hostel. While in the years after World War II, the Australian government may have widened the geographic scope of its migration policies, non-British migrants were still required under the Immigration Restriction Act to register as aliens with the authorities. So I should say aliens, but aliens with the authorities. Here we can see pages from Joseph and Yossi's alien registration documents, which document their physical characteristics, any changes in address, employment, etc. I'm seeing all these chat things come up and I'm so excited to read them afterwards. I'm looking forward to reading the stories. Nonetheless, the couple settled well into Australian life. Joseph was initially employed at James Kirby, a post-war manufacturer of consumer goods such as fridges and washing machines, before later working in retail at department store David Jones. Only 2 years after their arrival, they had saved enough money to buy a block of land and, aided by a bank loan, the couple built their own home, doing most of the work themselves. This is almost unimaginable to me, to be able to save enough for a home and build it in 2 years, but it's amazing. Here we can see a few photos of the couple building a garage on their home and relaxing in their kitchen. Well, as relaxed as one can be with a government photographer telling you to act natural anyway. They lived in Australia for 2 years before returning to the Netherlands. Well, when migrants came under the Netherlands-Australia Migration Agreement, one of the first post-war schemes under which Dutch migrants came to Australia was actually the Empire and Allied Ex-Servicemen Scheme. So on the right here is a very enthusiastic letter from a member of the public to the Minister for Immigration. The writer states that they were told that there is an army of Hollanders who wish to come to Australia. They go on to say, "Now I am willing to go there and get these men for our country, as we need such men as these. Holland's misfortune is our luck, so what about taking it? For my country's sake, I am willing to help get these men." As admirable as this man's offer was, the Empire and Allied ex-servicemen scheme was a little more structured than simply going to get the men. Introduced in 1947, the scheme offered assisted migration to Australia for former soldiers who had fought with the Allied forces during the war and their families. At first, it was limited to British and American personnel, but was soon expanded to include French, Danish, Belgian, Norwegian, and of course, Dutch ex-servicemen. Thousands of Dutch migrants arrived under the scheme, many of them directly from the Netherlands, East Indies, or Indonesia as it's now known. In fact, most of those who came to Australia under the scheme were Dutch. A series in our collection, just one of many, CP 900/6, contains thousands of applications for assisted passage from ex-servicemen of Dutch nationality, and some of those were digitised during Stage 4 of the Shared Histories Partnership. One of those records digitised was for a family called the Pett family. Pett applied in August 1950 under the ex-serviceman scheme for assisted passage for himself, his wife Anna, and their 3 children. Christian had a range of practical skills, having worked as a bricklayer and carpenter in Holland before the war, when he then served as a resistance worker. Character references and interviews for both Christian and Anna assured selection officers of their good conduct, and they were approved for migration to Australia. On the left, we can see a page from their digitised migrant selection documents, and on the right, we can see a page from their landing permit. Speaking only a little English and with £150 in their pocket, the Pett family prepared to leave the Netherlands. They boarded the Sibiak, and I've probably pronounced that wrong, so forgive me, but Sibiak in Rotterdam on the 31st of January 1951. As a passenger ship, the MS Sibiak had accommodation facilities for both first class and tourist class passengers. It offered comfortable cabins, or so we're told, dining rooms, lounges, and other amenities to ensure as comfortable journey as possible. That said, seasickness was an issue for a number of passengers, particularly during the North Sea part of the voyages where the seas were very rough. Pictured in the top left is an image of the Sibiak departing Rotterdam, and just below that we can see an image of passengers in one of the lounge areas of the ship. So that bottom left image is actually one from the Netherlands National Archive. So they've got some amazing photographs on theirs as well. At 8:30 a.m. on the 11th of March 1951, after 5.5 weeks on board, the Sibiak arrived in Sydney. According to reports from the Commonwealth Migration Officer, 449 migrants aboard the ship had accepted the offer of camp accommodation at Bathurst Centre. And based on the passenger list at the top of the page here, listing the intended address of the Pett family as camp accommodation, we can assume that they were included in this cohort for transfer to Bathurst. At 9:30 p.m. that day, 13 hours after the ship's arrival, the migrants boarded buses from the ship's side to Central Station to the special waiting train. The train departed for Bathurst at around 11 p.m. It must have been an exhausting day for the Pett family, particularly with 3 kids in tow, but they had finally arrived in their new home. The bottom 2 images show the Bathurst Migrant Reception Centre around the time that the Pett family was there. Now, not all Dutch migrants who immigrated were born in the Netherlands. For 300, most of you would probably know, but for 350 years, what we now know as Indonesia was under Dutch rule. In 1949, an agreement was reached between the Dutch and Indonesians, and Indonesia was granted complete and unconditional sovereignty on the 27th of December 1949. In the same year that Indonesian independence was formalized, Pieterdina was born in Indonesia to her Dutch parents, Pieter and Pieterdina Klop. We know from her address at time of application that at some point Pieterdina and her family returned to the Netherlands from Indonesia, and that Pieterdina did at least part of her education in the UK. While families and couples made up a sizable portion of the numbers of Dutch migrants to Australia, some people chose to migrate alone, either for the opportunity to start a new life or to join friends or family that may have already been living in Australia. In 1973, Pieterdina applied for assisted passage to Australia under the Australia and Netherlands Migration Agreement. An educated woman in good health with good employment prospects, Pieterdina ticked all the boxes in the view of the selection officers for suitability for migration to Australia. She was educated, she had good employment prospects, and she already had family in Australia. So her older brother, Paulus, was living in Melbourne at the time, and he provided a legal declaration that he would provide suitable accommodation for his sister for a minimum of 12 months, as well as a statement of confidence that he felt she already had sufficient funds of her own to settle in Australia. Here we can see a page from her migrant selection document, as well as the photograph that was attached to her application, and some documents illustrating her education and employment history. So you can see what a wealth of information is in the migrant selection documents. They really are fantastic. Once approved for migration to Australia, Pieterdina was given her booking voucher for her flight to Melbourne with a departure date of the 10th of September 1973. Pieterdina and her brother would not be on their own in Australia for long, however. So just a few months later, Paulus got married to a Dutch woman named Brigitte, who was originally born in Indonesia, but by then was living in The Hague in the Netherlands. And Brigitte joined him in Australia in February 1974. A year later, in 1975, Pieterdina and Paulus's parents, Peter and Gerdina Klop, as we heard earlier, also immigrated to Melbourne, just in time to attend another wedding, this time Pieterdina's. Now, before we move on to how to use our record search database, I wanted to highlight this series of records known as the Immigration Photographic Archive. Sorry, won't be a second. Just having some tech issues. There we go. Okay. So when the Department of Immigration was created in Australia in 1945, the department employed photographers to record the arrival and resettlement of migrants and their integration into the Australian community. Their photographs were used to advertise and promote Australia to potential migrants and to illustrate reports and other publications, and as a resource for research into immigration. The series comprises of, hang on, sorry, another technical issue here. Goodness gracious. Sorry, guys, give me a moment. Sorry, guys, I hope that didn't disrupt anybody. Great. Okay. Can everyone see the slide okay? It just crashed on me, so I'm hoping it's come back up. Lovely. Thank you, guys. Okay. So the series comprises of 36,000 black and white and colour images, and as we saw in the Teunissen family slides, the photographs highlight plentiful food, the modern conveniences in new Australian homes, and a healthy lifestyle in wide open spaces. This is just one of the series of records of photographs in our collection. It's important to note that many of the photographs in this series and in the collection in general actually don't necessarily have people's names, but simply refer to people as Dutch migrant or Dutch artist or newly settled Dutch Australian, things like that. So there may be surprise photos of your family there just waiting to be discovered. All right, so what we'll do now is we'll have a little bit of a look at record search. The record search is the National Archives collection database. It's the quickest and most efficient way of finding out what is held in the collection and of locating the records that you want. It's accessible anywhere in the world via the homepage of the National Archives of Australia. So it's www.naa.gov.au, as you can see at the top there. To get into record search, the easiest way is to click on the button on the homepage, which you can see I've circled in yellow. You can also get to record search through the Explore the Collection tab at the top of the screen. That tab also has a lot of, I highly recommend you jumping on there at some point because it also has a lot of information about a range of topics in our collection, and also a lot of links to stories and such about migration in general. So what we're going to do now, though, is jump into the database into record search. So let's pretend I've, because these are just screenshots, let's pretend I've clicked on record search. So that takes you into the basic search screen of record search. There is an advanced search tab as well, but I'm not going to go into that today as we have limited time and that one's a rabbit hole. So today I'm just going to show you the basic search, name search, and photo search tabs. So on the basic search screen, we can do a search for keyword or name, and we can narrow by date range if we want to. But I generally recommend that unless the name is very common, it's best to leave the date range blank initially to keep the search broad, as you can always refine your results later. So let's say we type in a name, and to make this a bit easier, I'm going to use one of the names from the presentation. So I'm going to type in the name, as you can see there, I've typed in the name Klop. I'm going to leave the date range blank and click on search. Now, I can't display all of the results in this slide, but we can see from the top middle of the page that searching for the surname Klop has returned 26 results. We can see a few headings along the top. So there is a series, there's a series number that refers to a group of similar types of items. So agencies create series or groups of items. The control symbol, which is essentially like a file number that the department would have used. The date range of the file. There's an item title as well, and that's generally what the department puts as the item title, though sometimes we do tweak. And ID, which is similar to a barcode. You might also note in this list that the access status in blue under each item. So under the Archives Act, the National Archives of Australia can only provide access to records that are in the open period, generally 20 years after records are created, and once the records have been through the compulsory examination process. So that's the only way we can release things, is to put them through that process. An access status of open means that a record has been through that examination process and is fine for public release. An access status of open with exception means it's been through that examination process and some material has been redacted and the rest has been released. And an access status of not yet examined means that it has not been examined yet. So we generally only access examined records in response to an application, which can be submitted via a record search. There's more information on our website about how to do that if you do come across any not yet examined files in your travels. Now, what about those page and camera symbols, I hear you ask? So those tell us whether or not an item has been digitized. A page symbol means it's a file that's been digitized. A photo symbol means it is a digitized photograph. If there's no symbol in that column, it means that the file has not yet been digitized. Most records in our collection are only digitized. I just realized some people I'm not going to make an assumption about everyone knowing what digitized means. Digitized means we've scanned it and put it online. So records are only digitized when someone orders and pays to have that done. Now I'll show you what it looks like if you click on a digital copy of one of those. So when you click on the digital copy, it will open in a pop-up screen. So from this screen, you can view each page by clicking next or previous, or you can jump forward to pages. So you could, if you want to jump to the end, you could type in 63 and hit go. You can also enlarge pages. So one of the features though that's often missed is the export PDF button. So I always like to draw people's attention to that. So down the bottom there, you can see next to the social media symbols, a little page with an arrow coming out of it on the right. So if you were to click on that button, it gives you the option to save the entire digitized file as a PDF. So highly recommend utilizing this option as it makes it much easier to print or save to your computer instead of saving every page individually. Another option for searching family records is the name search tab. So you can see along the top there, we had our basic search, we've skipped our advanced search, and we've gone to name search. So name search is a good starting point if you're looking for a specific name, and it's particularly useful when you're searching for a common name like Baker or Bakker. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but I think it's quite a common Dutch surname. You can either enter just a surname or you can do a surname and a given name and select a category of records from the drop-down menu. The downside to this is if you're only using name search and selecting particular categories of records, you might miss out on some results. So we normally recommend doing this in addition to a basic search. The last tab I'll show you is the photo search tab, which you can use to search for photographic material in our collection, such as the many photos I've used in my presentation. So many of those were pulled directly from our photo search, but they're linked to the digitized items that we have done under the project. When using photo search, keep your searches broad where possible, using keywords or names. Date ranges are optional, but can be useful to narrow down your results. In the bottom left, you can see what results look like for a search using the photo search tab. So for that one, I believe I just typed in Dutch and it brought up those results there. So you get a range of different things, and you can sort those results a few different ways, and you can look at them as a list as well if you prefer not to look at all the icons. Okay. All right, so I believe that Marika she is on here, so I'm going to hand over to her now. So she's a senior researcher at the, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Huygens Institute, I believe, and is going to share a little bit about their plans for the collections digitised under the partnership. So I'll hand over to Marika if she's ready.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the National Archives of Australia with this achievement, finalizing stage 4 of the Dutch-Australian Shared Cultural Heritage Project and celebrating this with this great exhibition, Shared Histories on Dutch-Australian Migration. I also like to thank both the National Archive The Hague and the National Archive of Australia for their partnership and for their collaboration with the Huygens Institute for the last 6 years. But in fact, this exhibition symbolizes a much longer collaboration and a broader ambition, about which I will tell you a little bit more. As Amanda told already, I'm a historian at the Huygens Institute, and together with digital historian Rick Hoekstra, responsible for the project Migrant, Mobilities and Connection. And the aim of this project is to develop methods and examples to show how the collection on migration heritage that are being digitized by both the National Archives can be linked in their context. We all know, of course, that because of the transnational character of migration, migration history and migrant heritage is by its very nature dispersed over different collections and in different countries. So therefore, we use the migrant registration card system in the Dutch government, used to register the migrants in the Netherlands, but also used to keep track of them in Australia for assistance after their arrival via the Dutch consulates. And I will show you a picture within a moment. So this card system now functions as a structural device. It is a kind of database avant la lettre. The cards were created as a MasterCard, giving access to the application files that you can find in the National Archives, and Amanda just showed them to you. In the Netherlands, the files themselves are destroyed due to privacy regulations, but fortunately kept by the National Archives of Australia. So while preparing this talk, I realized that it's already 20 years ago that I made a research trip to Australia. As I was working for the Dutch foreign policy as well at that time, Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands asked me to inspect a collection of cards on Dutch emigrants. It had became obsolete when the Dutch government stopped their immigration stimulation policy in the 1992s. So the then Consul General stored 50,000 cards in 48 large iron drawers in the attic of the Dutch Australian Cultural Centre, but wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And while reading them, it only took me a few hours to undergo what I call the migrant experience, hard as it was sometimes. It was a kind of historical once-in-a-lifetime sensation to stumble upon such a collection that could become a goldmine for future historical research, but also for the community itself, especially because it covered the majority of those who went and sometimes returned, of course, and because the National Archives of Australia had a counter-registration files of the same people with complementing facts. Many of those people are still alive, and this is certainly true for their children and grandchildren. So the 50,000 cards were shipped to Holland and in 2006 handed over to the National Archives in The Hague. And this is actually where our collaboration started with the archives and with other Dutch and Australian scholars like Nonja Peters, who is also in this Stage 4 collection. So the main idea behind Project Migrant is that migrant registration systems can play a pivotal role in digitally connecting different types of information, ranging from personal stories and documents or private photo collections to policy files or to photo collections taken by both governments to encourage migration. but also to moving images and sound. And Amanda already showed you several types of immigration records held by the National Archives in Australia. And we all know that heritage institutions have used stories of migrants before to illustrate the migrant experience, even digitally. But these are most of the time invariably confined to a few examples and based on their own collections. So 2 years ago, Nonja Peters, Rick and I made another exhibition, physically and online. You can still find it on our website. And we called it People Movement Stories. And there we experimented with the above idea of combining personal stories and interviews with designing online timelines with live course events of the same migrant. And ideally, these are based on the registration systems, giving us the opportunity to broaden those stories using the digitized archival collection, even with policy files in both countries. So this way, we can make an aggregated migrant experience containing different or even opposite perspectives, not only of those who went, but also of those who returned or sometimes never went. It also offers a kind of collective history for those migrants who left hardly any paper traces in the archives, because they can compare their stories. And one of the examples on our website, which is still in a very provisional state because we have to deal with permission due to the privacy regulations in the Netherlands, is of the family Teunissen. Amanda talked already about them. Nienke Teunissen, who was interviewed for your exhibition, is a young journalist who wanted to make a podcast about her grandfather and his life. She never knew him. In 1950s, he emigrated to Australia, like more Dutch people did. And she wanted some background information from me on post-World War II emigration. And when Nienke and I met, the story of the Teunissen family turned out to be a very moving story. But we were also able to find lots of information, not only the registration card of the National Archives in The Hague, but also some governmental photos of her grandpa building his own house in Australia on the website of the National Archives Australia. So Nienke was excited because this fitted completely in with the story her aunt Tanya told her already for her podcast. So Rick and I asked the family for permission to use their story as an example on our website. If you could put on slide, Amanda. So on the slide you can see it's a screenshot. It's still work in progress. So for stage 4, the National Archives of Australia now also digitized their immigration records. And the family has been very kind in sharing with us their private photo collections, some more documents, and even movies. And all this still has to be added. So for the next year, Rick and Nonja and I are planned to work on more examples. And we will do this in very close collaboration, not only with both National Archives, but also with the Dutch-Australian Cultural Centre in Australia. So any news on the project Migrant, or when we think we would need the help of the Dutch-Australian community, for instance, in getting permission, will be on the DACC website. So thank you very much. And as I can still hear you, I can't answer questions. So Amanda, the floor is yours again.
Oh, thank you so much. That was really interesting. It's fantastic. Thank you for speaking to us today.